Welcome everybody. Is that working?
Yep.
No. Give me a minute. Yes. Half of you think it is, half of you don't. Serena's saying talk up. Look, thank you very much for coming. My name's Richard Dennis. I'm the director of the Australia Institute, and we put on politics in the pub about once a month or so, and there's a few unfamiliar faces here tonight, which is great. That's what we try to do. We're a think tank based here in Canberra, and we love putting on events where we get people like tonight's speaker, Lyn White, to come along and get us thinking. So I'll give you some more housekeeping at the end, but just so you know, our next speaker in a month's time is Frank Brennan, Father Frank Brennan, who's going to talk about asylum seeker policy. So, but I'll come back to talk about that at the end. But again, if you haven't come to politics in the pub before, it's exactly what the name suggests. We just want to give people a forum to hear from fantastic speakers and ask some questions and meet new friends and talk amongst yourselves. So there's parmigianas downstairs, apparently very good if you do eat meat. I don't eat the parmigiana myself. And there's obviously a bar, so relax. If you haven't come before, thanks for coming. And if you want to know about future events, there'll be some sign-up sheets floating around. We just send you an email to let you know about times and dates and speakers. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Now I'm just going to introduce Lyn, and then she's going to talk for half an hour or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So save your questions up, and tonight I think we've got a video and audio, but you might have to listen very carefully. So, and Lyn might have to tell you if you didn't hear a key bit, but fingers crossed the technology will work. So now, please allow me to introduce our speaker tonight, Lyn White, who's the Campaign Director for Animals Australia. She's recognised and respected as one of Australia's foremost animal advocates and animal cruelty investigators, and the importance of Lyn's work has received critical international acclaim. In fact, she was nominated for Australian of the Year, and I understand that she received the most nominations. Is that correct? The most nominations in the awards history. So you must be doing something right, Lyn, and presumably that's why so many Canberrans have come out to hear you speak tonight. Formerly a South Australian police officer, Lyn's animal cruelty investigations have taken her to Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Indonesia. And in the wake of her 11th live export investigation, tonight Lyn will discuss what happened in Indonesia, the public and political reaction in Australia, the work she believes still needs to be done to prevent animal suffering, and how the extraordinary events of 2011 changed the animal welfare landscape in Australia. So please join me in welcoming Lyn White.
Thank you, Richard, and it's lovely to be here with you in Canberra tonight. Just get myself. Can I just move that forward a little bit? Thank you. Well, for any of you that saw Australian Story a few weeks ago, you know that it wasn't that long ago that I thought my career path was mapped out in front of me. I loved being a member of the South Australian Police Force and the challenges that policing presented on a daily basis. I was happy with the salary I earned and the career prospects that lay ahead. So not in my wildest dreams could I have predicted the dramatic change in direction that my life would take, that I would leave policing, that I would conduct investigations in slaughterhouses in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, that I would be interviewed on every current affairs program around Australia, have a Jordanian princess as a friend, and God forbid spend 6 months of my life walking the halls of Parliament House here in Canberra. So for all of you here who, like me, some time ago now, made a list as to what I wanted to achieve in life to feel successful and fulfilled, just be aware that life may well have other plans in store for you, as it did for me. See, I've discovered when you become aware of overwhelming injustice and you decide to act on it, that your life gets thrown into some sort of current, and you have no idea where that current is going to take you, but you just trust with every fibre of your being that your life is headed in the right direction. Mine has obviously taken me to places that I never expected to go, and to witnessing more human and animal suffering than most. And as a result, it has made me think deeply on life, on our responsibilities to each other and to other living beings. And I've come to realise that there is a dire need for us to reevaluate our individual roles in this world and what we're capable of contributing. That it's actually not successful lives in the traditional sense that this world and its living beings are needing us to lead. They're actually crying out for us to lead meaningful and significant lives. I was 38 when I was first awakened to many of the injustices occurring towards animals in the world. And it was during that year that a good friend of mine gave me a card, and within that card were the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson: "Go not where the path may lead, go instead where there is no path and forge a trail." Well, I'd never been a leader, and I certainly never wanted to be a leader. In fact, I was the quiet kid in class at school that never raised her hand to answer a question for fear of getting the answer wrong. And whilst I was recognised as a good cop, I knew that for me, the uniform gave me confidence that wasn't evident elsewhere in my life. So walking a road less travelled or forging a new path wasn't in any way appealing to me. I have learned so much over the past decade, but perhaps the most valuable lesson is that we underestimate our own capacity, and that no matter how ordinary we perceive ourselves to be, when faced with a great need and when called upon to assist, we are all capable of doing the extraordinary. I don't know how often over the past few years I'd love to have $1 for every time someone has said to me, "Thank you, I couldn't do what you do." And every time my response is the same: I am no different from any of you. And in fact, if you ever need living proof that you don't need a university degree or any special skills or courage to make a contribution, you need to look no further than me. You really just need the desire to do so and to not let injustice go unchallenged. For the first 18 years of my career, I was looking after human victims, driving around in a police vehicle, answering cries for help from people. And we can get ourselves into all sorts of crises, but we were always there to be called on, to protect and represent victims, and to bring those who caused them harm to justice. Since that time, working as an animal advocate, I've come to realise what an enormous advantage we have over animals, simply because we have a language that we can understand and that we can cry out for help. And the fact that animals cannot do so and cannot tell us what they're enduring is at times used mercilessly against them. I considered myself worldly and informed as a 38-year-old hardened police officer, yet I didn't even know what was happening to animals in my own country. I had no idea at the age of 38 that we exported up to 5 million animals a year to countries where there were no laws to protect them from cruelty. When I found out, I thought, how could we? The wrong was so obvious. I had no idea at the age of 38 that the vast majority of animals in human care in this country, some 500 million raised in factory farms each year, were denied the legal protection that is provided to our pets for commercial reasons. And again I thought, how could this possibly be when we know that all animals share the ability to suffer? I had thought that Australia was a world leader in animal welfare, and what I came to realise was that we had industries that were just more adept at keeping their secrets, and that our governments had actually legalised animal cruelty. I left policing when I came to realise that the system of justice that I had been so proud to uphold as a police officer didn't actually protect the most innocent and vulnerable members in our society, those who cannot cry out for help, and therefore those who actually need our protection most of all. You know, the first recorded use of the phrase "out of sight, out of mind" was way back in the 16th century, but perhaps no industry has profited more from this unfortunate human trait than Australia's live export trade. Some 160 million animals have been exported live from Australia over the past 3 decades. Had any of them been able to tell us what they endured, I have no doubt that live export would have ended long ago. This is an industry that has only prospered because the suffering inherent to its operations occurs in ships in the open ocean or in countries 10,000 kilometres away. I have observed on so many occasions, spending nights in abattoirs, the terrible treatment of Australian animals, not only disturbed by what was going on in front of me, but by the knowledge that we had literally supplied millions of animals to that fate over a period of decades. On each occasion that footage from these investigations aired on Australian television, there was a public outcry. So there's no doubt that this is an industry that troubles deeply the conscience of Australians, and understandably so, because there are aspects of the live trade that are completely indefensible in animal welfare terms. Long-distance transportation by sea entails inherent risks that can never be overcome, that have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of animals in disasters over the years. But what needs to be known is, especially on sheep shipments, hundreds and thousands, sometimes thousands of sheep will die every single shipment from failing to eat or from enteritis, and they're just part of the collateral damage of this trade. But perhaps the issue that disturbs the conscience of Australians most is supplying animals to countries where there are no laws to protect them from cruelty. As you know, it was in March last year that I spent 6 consecutive nights in Indonesian slaughterhouses, witnessing the most brutal treatment imaginable of Australian cattle, and the majority of it being facilitated by restraint boxes that were proudly branded with Meat and Livestock Australia and LiveCorp logos. Never had the culpability and complicity of the live trade in animal cruelty been more obvious to the government or more obvious to the community. But the reality is, it wasn't the first time. Some of you here may know the story of Basseterre Abattoir in Cairo, the enormous, terrible facility that is on the outskirts of that city, that any government or industry official had ever gone into this brutal facility and deemed it acceptable for Australian animals, or any animals for that matter, is inconceivable and unforgivable. The first slaughter hall that I went into in that facility was slaughtering camels, and their method of doing so was to run the camels, terrified animals, down the centre of the hall, with slaughtermen standing on each side with long blades, and they slashed at the necks of these animals as they ran past until they finally succumbed through blood loss. Slashing and stabbing was the standard method of slaughter in Egypt, and yet our live trade had knowingly sent some 1 million cattle there over the previous decade. I've said on many occasions that the willingness of Australia's live trade to supply cattle to a situation where they knew that they would be disabled through having their eyes stabbed and their tendons slashed over that period of time should have ended the live export back in 2007. Instead, all they did was lose one market, and they continued to export to other markets, and as we now know, to equally brutal treatment. It should have been the wake-up call to government to investigate every single export market and the treatment that Australian animals were receiving. Instead, they supplied the live trade with money to improve animal welfare in these countries. And as we said last year, charging representatives of the live trade with the responsibility of encouraging importing nations to improve animal welfare is like putting the tobacco industry in charge of the healthcare system. And I saw the repercussions of that last year. As I stood in those abattoirs in Indonesia and watched Australian cattle being brought into those boxes, having their legs tied, being tripped, terrified, onto their sides, their full weight crashing on onto a concrete slab, rearing up in their terror and coming crashing down so that their jaw was hitting the sharp edge of a concrete blood drain that was part of the Australian design. And I have never felt so appalled or so ashamed to be an Australian. How the government allowed the trade to continue without oversight is just inconceivable. That taxpayers' money were invested in these cruel devices was just appalling. The government now, of course, have outlawed them because international experts have declared the obvious, that they're inhumane. But you would have thought that self-interest, if nothing else, would have forced greater government oversight when they knew what this industry was capable of. Last year was undoubtedly the most challenging and most extraordinary year of my life. And hopefully I'm going to provide you with a bit of a snapshot of it. As Richard said, you might have to listen quite hard. It's a series of media grabs from last year, and please be reassured that the distressing footage has been removed from it.
Tonight's White's Four Corners program features shocking video footage.
Animals Australia has again been responsible for extensive evidence gathering in Indonesia.
Animals Australia filmed at 11 of the 100 abattoirs in Indonesia. Some scenes are too gruesome to show.
We'd assumed that because there were greater level of industry involvement in Indonesia, the treatment of livestock would be better, but we couldn't have been more wrong.
I'd seen gruesome pictures of this place before we came here, but actually being here with the smell of blood and fear is almost totally overwhelming. The noise of those terrified animals makes you wonder how the Australian cattle industry could support an operation like this, but also how the Australian taxpayer could be helping to pay for it.
Brutal mistreatment of Australian cattle, slow and painful death. Hit, their eyes gouged and tails broken.
Effectively being tortured, seriously abused. How did this cruelty happen for so long?
They were clearly cognizant of what was going on, and it was causing them extreme fear.
This is clearly absolutely not acceptable for a developed country to be sending those cattle in there.
We have an industry, a live export trade that has thrived on the fact that where they send animals, they know that Australian eyes are not going to be seeing what occurs.
For the first time, RSPCA and Animals Australia are working on a joint campaign to end the live trade of cattle to Indonesia.
We are being swamped on the soapbox. Australians were shocked by that footage. Industry was shocked by that footage. Disgusting.
And it's inhumane.
Enormous public outcry.
Thousands of emails.
Animals Australia's campaign against the trade has made it a mainstream issue.
Well, James Riley blew up on talkback radio and in Parliament. MPs, steeled by enormous public outrage, are prepared to force the government to act.
We've got to immediately stop the export of animals to Indonesia, and we're going to wind up the industry in 3 years.
This trade needs to stop.
The Australian government needs to do the right thing.
Live animal exports are shiploads of misery.
If the true moral test of a nation is our treatment of those who are most vulnerable and dependent on our care, including our animals, then we're failing. Our top story today, the federal government is suspending all live cattle exports to Indonesia.
These cattle in Darwin are no longer heading for a cruel demise in Indonesian slaughterhouses.
A $300 million a year industry is at a standstill.
Just recently, I returned from an investigation in Turkey, which is a new and developing market for Australian animals. There, we also documented horrendous slaughter methods were routine.
More anger over live export. Thousands of people have rallied around Australia to push for an end to the live export trade.
Thousands of people.
Thousands of people. This large group is demanding an end to live cattle export.
Protesters say above all this is about giving a voice to animals that are suffering in silence.
We don't want it. We want it to stop completely.
That's disgusting. I can't stand it. The crisis in the trade has triggered a major change. Large numbers of Australian animals will now be stunned before they're killed.
In Jordan, more than 80% of all livestock is stunned before slaughter. It's a program that owes its origins to an investigation by Animals Australia in 2007.
It's been hugely instrumental here because the original footage from Animals Australia was what set me off.
The reality across the Middle East today is that live exports are in decline.
This issue will not go away.
What I can say to you is that our investigations will continue into this trade, and no doubt we will be providing further evidence of Australian animals being cruelly treated. So much was felt throughout last year. Let me take you through some of it. I felt despair at what I witnessed in Indonesia and that my own countrymen had been prepared to supply animals to that fate. I felt anger at the failure of consecutive federal governments to properly monitor this industry, especially considering there had been ongoing evidence of their willingness to supply animals regardless of how brutally they were treated. I felt overwhelming gratitude to the wonderful Sarah Ferguson and the Four Corners team who had the courage to air a program that no other commercial network was ever going to touch, and for their commitment to revealing the truth. I felt astonishment really at the scale of the media response, which over following months generated 60,000 further media articles, which was unprecedented. I of course felt hope because we had an overwhelming, a tidal wave of public outrage and anger, which showed so clearly that Australians care about animal welfare and wanted this trade to end. I felt gratitude towards our friends at RSPCA Australia and also our political friends, and we stood on the hill and we spoke with one voice, calling for this trade to end. And in the end, of course, I felt disappointment that our political leaders failed to show the ethical leadership necessary and to listen to the voice of the people and bring an end to an industry that brings such great shame on this nation. But that disappointment was tempered by knowing that this trade was never going to be the same again, that we had brought it to the brink, and that we weren't going to end our efforts in regards to this industry before we pushed it into the dark pages of history where it belongs. But there was an outcome from last year that had been impossible for us to predict, but which was within the realms of anyone who retained a belief in the human spirit to hope for. The experience of a single black, beautiful steer, who we called Tommy, resonated and reverberated in the hearts and minds of all Australians. During that few seconds of footage, everyone was living Tommy's experience and understanding it too, as he watched his mates get slaughtered. And I think every one of us wanted to reach out and comfort him and save him from his fate. That I was unable to do so will always be one of my greatest regrets. But I know that more than any other animal in Australian history, Tommy has awoken the hearts and minds of Australians to understand that animals raised for food suffer too, and that it is within our power to prevent that suffering. As a former police officer and now as an animal advocate, I guess I've had a rare opportunity to have an insight into the systems of justice in this country that are in place for humans and animals. In our human system of justice, we consider crimes that are committed against the young and the elderly to be the most heinous of all. Why? Because we believe that to take advantage of the defenceless is an immoral act. And when courts are weighing up the penalties, they always take into account the motivation of the defender. If that crime, if that abuse and harm towards that defenceless victim was motivated by personal gain, personal profit, then the sentence is always harsher, except if that defenceless and innocent victim was an animal raised for food. And then the courts can take no action whatsoever because governments have legalised that abuse. The obvious ethical question is why? The very same undesirable human traits, cruelty, indifference, and malevolence, are in action whether the victim is human or an animal. So why, if the victim is human, is the offender punished, and if the victim is an animal, financially rewarded? It was Gandhi that recognised the huge ethical challenge that defenceless animals place before us when he uttered that famous line, "The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated." Gandhi recognised that the defencelessness of animals provided us with the ultimate temptation to profit through their suffering simply because we have the power to do so. But he also recognised that a considered decision to deny that temptation and instead protect them from harm meant evoking the finest elements of our humanity, compassion and mercy. Another great mind, Nobel Peace Prize winner Dr. Albert Schweitzer, also recognised the ethical significance of our relationship with animals, not just for them, but for us, when he said, "Until he extends the circle of his compassion to all life, man himself will not know peace." Schweitzer recognised that our treatment of animals not only defines our present, but our future. That whilst cruelty to animals exists, it reveals that we as a species are being ruled by our weaknesses rather than by our strengths. If you look back through history, you can see so clearly that we as a species have always had the courage to explore. But it seems that we have been so busy exploring what is without us and around us that we have forgotten to explore what is within us, the depths and breadths of our humanity. And unfortunately, our political leaders are not inspiring us or encouraging us to do so. In reflecting back on last year and how someone like me ended up being recognised for their work with those nominations for Australian of the Year and Newsmaker of the Year, I thought of two possibilities really. One, obviously it reveals the scale of public outrage and opposition to the live trade. But the other possibility that it reveals is that we have a community that has the inherent need to see someone, anyone, take a stand against injustice and cruelty. And that it ended up being me that was embraced, a very ordinary ex-plod from South Australia, I think shows the depths of that craving for someone to show ethical leadership. That our political leaders and their advisors can't see this and haven't responded to it is astonishing. You know, last year 2 MPs, Andrew Wilkie and Adam Band, introduced legislation, bills to ban live export. And we were in the House for the voting of those bills. If it was an accurate indication, there were only 2 MPs in Australia that didn't support one of the cruelest industries that this world has ever known. And of course that wasn't the case, which is why the sad nature of that spectacle was just increased by saying MPs from both parties that we knew opposed live export have to vote in line with an outdated party policy. The fact that the ALP and the coalition remain wedded to this cruel trade defies logic, it defies economic arguments, and it certainly defies the wishes of the vast majority of Australians. Most producers already have an alternative local market to supply their animals to. Last year, Australia's sheep meat exports to the Middle East were worth $120 million more than live sheep exports, showing the willingness to take a chilled product. That's increasing significantly each year and would increase even more if we weren't providing the alternative of live animals. The Wilkie Bill, which would have phased out live export over 3 years, allowed for readjustment of enterprises and the reopening of processing facilities in the top end. That such a reasonable piece of legislation wasn't supported by either party should rest heavily on the consciences of their power brokers. We know that the trade won't be the same again. The Gillard government has been forced to take unprecedented action in regulating, bringing in regulations that have required the implementation of assured supply chains. But even if you've been following the media, you would have seen in the last week already our investigations have shown that these systems will be breached and that they're unworkable. Why? Because basically we still have an industry that is self-regulating, that have shown time and time again that they can't be trusted, and we're dealing with countries that are still to prioritise animal welfare. And unfortunately, regardless, even if they're met, the failure of the government to mandate pre-slaughter stunning will still mean that animals are suffering long and painful deaths in importing countries. And of course, animals will continue to suffer at sea whilst their trade continues. Do ethics have a place in politics? Obviously the answer is yes, but I think there's a general feeling in the community, or a general wondering in the community, if this is the case. There seems to be truth in the saying that a politician thinks of the next election, whilst a statesman thinks of the next generation. How the Australian community would embrace the emergence of a statesman or woman who had integrity, vision, and when it came to animal issues, was prepared to consider ethics as well as profits. You know, the reason why that Coney video was such a worldwide phenomenon, watched by countless millions of people, was not because it was about Joseph Coney. There are unfortunately other despicable human beings in this world as well. It was because someone was finally saying what people in all nations want to hear, that we, humanity, can be better than this. If we unite, we can take a stand against injustice, bring those who cause harm to the defenceless to justice, and we actually can, if we stand united, leave this world a kinder and a better place. That's why people embraced the Coney video and the Coney vision. You know, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about working in this field is that it's just not about animals. It's about us and our humanity. It's that defenceless animals actually challenge us not just to be human beings, but to be humane beings. For me, working in this field has never been about promoting animal rights. To end animal cruelty, we don't have to give them rights. We just have to address human wrongs. It's 2012. No ethical nation can export millions of animals to other countries where there are no laws to protect them from cruelty. No ethical nation can provide legal protection to the animals that we bond with and not to the animals that are raised for food, when we know that all animals share the ability to suffer. There is such a dire need in the community, even though there are vastly different views about what the use of animals should be, to reach a point of agreement. And I think that was probably put as succinctly as I've ever heard it by an American speechwriter called Matthew Scully, who said, "We cannot just take from these animals. We must give them something in return. We owe them a merciful life, and we owe them a merciful death." If the Gillard government thinks that the action that they've taken on live export will turn opposition into acceptance, I think they're sadly mistaken. I don't think the community will ever forgive or forget the live export industry for their culpability in animal cruelty in Indonesia. Senator Ludwig warned the live trade last year that they were in danger of losing their social licence to operate, but the reality is we never gave them one. It was some 200 years ago now that another shipboard trade in living beings was defended on the basis of profit and the schoolyard excuse, if we don't do it, someone else will. And it took the extraordinary efforts of British politician William Wilberforce to bring an end to the slave trade and to awaken his nation to the fact that profits should never come at the cost of our ethics, and that considering the interests of others, no matter how different they may be from us, is at the very core of human morality. Causing unnecessary suffering to other living beings simply because we have the power to do so and because they're different from us can never be ethically justified. And deep down, we all know that. I said earlier that if any of the animals that had been subjected to live export could have told us what they endured, that live export would have ended long ago, but they shouldn't need to tell us. Transporting animals halfway around the world to be slaughtered will never be logical or acceptable in animal welfare terms. Supplying animals to countries where there are no laws to protect them from cruelty is quite simply immoral. There is no other word for it. As we abandon them, we abandon our ethical principles. The live trade knows that it's on the precipice, that government support is waning, that the vast majority of Australians want that trade to end, and they know that they cannot afford to have one more disaster, whether it be shipboard or in an importing country. And it will inevitably happen. The tragedy is that further animals will have to suffer in the interim. Probably the greatest lesson that I learned from the life of William Wilberforce is that the voice calling for an end to cruelty must never waver, it must never become disheartened, and it must always keep revealing the truth. Because in the end, when good people unite, they can and they will end even the greatest of injustices. Live export will end. It's just a matter of when. And until it does, our efforts will continue on behalf of those animals. And never again will out of sight mean out of mind. Thank you for having me here tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Lyn. I'm sure there's a question or two for you lurking in the room somewhere. Who wants to go first?
Or if there's not, you can just bring me wine from the bar. I'm only kidding.
There's one on the way. Well done, Dave. Yeah, white or red?
White, thank you.
White, thanks, Dave. Question up the front here.
It's about the almighty dollar, I suppose, but another thing comes to mind that in general, animals are sort of suffering throughout the world anyhow, in many ways, through illegal poaching and a whole range of things. What other nations in the world that you are aware of or not that perhaps do the same thing that Australia's doing? Is Australia just the sort of the blatant villain in the whole scenario?
Well, we're the largest exporter in the world. The other country that is doing a lot of exporting is South America, but I think we're the only one that really has seemingly strong animal welfare standards in place that we've been prepared to put to one side to export animals. And certainly there is no other country in the world that can supply the sheep, the type of sheep that we are supplying to the Middle East, which is why it's incredibly frustrating that politicians actually won't recognise that the Middle East is now the largest destination for our sheep meat exports, which is so revealing. And when you travel up there, you can see it's a changing society, that the young people are coming through, that the traditional ways are going to be left behind. But unfortunately, we keep reinforcing certain habits and bad habits, but also we're dealing with large companies up there that, if you look at it from the economic situation, are actually getting all the value adding through taking live animals from Australia. We've mounted very, very strong economic arguments between our organisations, but for whatever reason, our view doesn't get listened to in the same way. I'd note that the Prime Minister spent considerable time with the head of the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association. No matter what we did last year, the RSPCA or Animals Australia couldn't speak with the Prime Minister despite having extensive knowledge of the situation that she was meant to be making decisions on.
Yep, in the middle there.
I just have a general comment that for someone that probably hadn't had a lot of public speaking experience 12 months ago, you've got a great presence on stage and you're an inspirational speaker, and thanks for coming and speaking to us tonight.
I told you to be a tough crowd, Lyn.
Can I just follow that with a question?
Yeah.
With the alternatives that you talked about, as far as like to industry, what was their response? You mentioned alternatives not to affect industry from an economic standpoint. Just wondering what the industry had to say when those alternatives were discussed and put to the table.
Well, we've had a problem for quite a long time with Meat and Livestock Australia, because they're meant to be representing the chilled meat exporters to the Middle East as well as the live exporters, but for whatever reason, until last year, when I think they recognised that live export wasn't good for their brand, they were giving a great deal more focus to live export. They certainly haven't been, and I know from being in the marketplace in the Middle East, they haven't been promoting the benefits of getting chilled meat from Australia. Even if you're just looking at it from a perspective of people wanting better meat quality, transporting animals and putting them through all the stresses of long-distance transportation doesn't make sense. But they just haven't been willing to promote the alternatives up to now. But I think one of the things that's happened as a result of our work, aside from other aspects, is that it's increasing significantly the cost to exporters to put these new systems in place. And all of that, I think, is going to help in the end, hopefully make the alternative a more viable one. But, you know, and I have to say that whilst Joe Ludwig got given a really hard time last year, and especially by the cattle producers, the Gillard government has done more than any other government previously. It's just that they're trying to set up a system that simply is doomed to fail. And in the end, you just have to look at the ethics of this industry, that it's actually wrong in the first place, and make a decision based on that. And unfortunately, this is going to be death by 1,000 cuts. And as I said, animals are going to continue to suffer in the interim.
Question, Pearson? Yeah.
What about the situation in Australian abattoirs? Like, there have been some studies recently that show that there's definitely some cruelty and sadism happening there.
Yeah.
Repeating the question.
Yes. The question was, what about Australian abattoirs? And you're probably speaking to the fact that there's been two exposés, basically, charges laid, an abattoir in Victoria and an abattoir in New South Wales. People don't like to work in abattoirs generally, and that's why there's a lot of, you know, actually there's a lot of immigrants that are brought in especially to work in our abattoirs, because I think deep down very few people actually like to kill animals and kill them on that level, and therefore you have to shut off part of your conscience to do it. And I think that leads to them not seeing them as living beings, and it extends the problems in regards to the cruelty that they endure. They were both domestic abattoirs, which means that they don't have to have a government veterinarian there during their operations. Export abattoirs do. I think that really rocked the industry. The response was very strong with both of them, because certainly one of the impacts of the Indonesian situation last year was that meat consumption in Australia reduced. And the last thing that those that produce animals for meat wanted was further bad publicity around how they're being slaughtered, because that's exactly what turns people into vegetarians. So the answer to that, I think, is obviously greater scrutiny, proper auditing. You know, we're calling for CCTV cameras, but they would need to be appropriately monitored as well. But there's much more that can be done.
Okay, I think there was another question at the back. Yeah.
What makes an Australian animal any more superior to one of another origin? So if Australia were to ban the trade, and another country would more than readily fill that gap, so in the immediate term, would having an Australian oversight, or having the oversight of the Australian government to somewhat see to improve those practices be better than your comment of outside, out of line, if Australia was not involved in the trade? That other country, or the, say Indonesia, wouldn't readily want to improve their practices, wouldn't see any need to improve their practices because that trade, or Australia would be able to market or be involved in the trade.
What you're suggesting is something that the industry has raised in defence of itself in recent years. It didn't raise that at all until we started conducting investigations, and then all of a sudden they got an interest in improving animal welfare in importing nations. Bottom line is that 30 years of industry presence in importing nations has not improved animal welfare. The current situation with the government trying to bring in assured supply chains, accredited supply chains, and bring in OIE standards, what they call OIE, which is the World Organisation for Animal Health, we're still talking about absolute base level standards, like not cutting tendons, not beating, throwing animals. You know, the work that we did in Indonesia last year, seemingly, if industry reports are right, have increased stunning in that country, which is a terrific outcome, but that was won by the work of our animal welfare groups, not by industry. And we're still concerned at the lack of monitoring and auditing. What you raised in regards to Australian abattoirs and the problems that can occur here, if these countries actually don't have legislation in place in the first place to make workers accountable if they breach standards, then it's just absolute, you know, going to be chaos in those abattoirs in the end, because there cannot be oversight, and the only oversight is coming from industry. And as I said, I only have half an hour, but I could spend 6 hours telling you about why you wouldn't trust this industry. So the only way is to encourage greater imports of chilled meat. The Wilkie legislation was incredibly reasonable, and a lot of those countries, especially in the Middle East, they don't want other sheep apart from Australian because they're a different body type, the merinos, and they can't get them from anywhere else. They can't get them from the Horn of Africa. They're like little goats that come from there. So, you know, we have shown in the past, when drought has reduced numbers of sheep that we could export, imports of chilled meat go up. There's a direct correlation. So it is an industry that could be changed if the will was there.
You mentioned throughout your speech historical moments where humanity's been able to change everything for the greater good. I'm just wondering what you think the role of religion is in animal rights, and how those beliefs, which are millenniums old, can be able to change religious practice and religious beliefs towards man's, woman's, human superiority over an animal.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. If you look at halal slaughter, for example, you know, quite often it's blamed on religious cruelty, basically, in slaughter processes. I'm yet to see in the Middle East an animal slaughtered in accordance with Islamic customs. It just doesn't happen. The work that I've been doing in Jordan with the royal family is about raising what religion is actually saying, because it in no way is protecting animals at this stage, and it may be a way that it can change things in the Middle East, in Muslim countries where religion is part of their daily life. But at the moment it's not in any way doing that. it's interesting that Islam actually speaks more strongly to kindness to animals than any other religion. I mean, Christianity doesn't speak very strongly. I mean, we can pull out bits and pieces, but certainly it hasn't been helpful, I would suggest, to this stage. It'd be great to see religious leaders here in Australia actually take an ethical stand on a trade like this and say that it's not right, but it hasn't happened as yet. But certainly in other countries where religion is part of the daily influence, that's part of the strategy that we're working from within in these countries.
Yep.
I was just wondering if you can suggest a few things that everyone can do to make sure animal welfare and the export trade are on the government forefront, and even if it's not Gillard government, maybe the next one, what we can do to stop it.
It's scary. Look, I think everything to do with campaigning for change is about consistency. And speaking to MPs, they received more correspondence on this issue than they've on any other in their history. I think it's very important that they understand that it's not going to go away. What we need to try and get is a point of difference between the two parties. At the moment, they've been on really easy ground because they haven't got an opposition that's taking a different position. And in the end, I think it's going to have to be that perhaps the first time in Australian history that an animal welfare issue actually becomes a reason why a government may stay in or not. And that's the message that we need to get across. If you speak to individual pollies, I have no doubt if they're able to express their views honestly, that most of them are opposed at a personal level. So we're getting this ridiculous situation. I mean, the ALP conference was very close vote-wise to changing its position on this trade. So we're getting there. It's about consistency and not getting frustrated by getting form letters back from your pollies, because they are being noted. That's the message that we're getting back.
So keep harassing them?
Absolutely.
Aaron?
Hi. Thank you for doing what you're doing. I liked your quote about Gandhi that you cited, that you can judge a society by how it treats its animals. I want to come back to the issue about what makes an Australian animal different to an Indonesian animal, say. One of the perhaps unintended consequences of the changes in the animal welfare framework for live exports is that Indonesia now intends to dramatically reduce, if not do away with altogether, the importation of animals for slaughter. Now, while we might be able to have some say in how animals are treated in Indonesia, if they are our animals, and if they are governed by our regulatory frameworks to an extent, if it is simply Indonesian animals that are being treated by Indonesian standards, is that much better? Is that much of an improvement? Our animals are okay, but how about theirs?
No, well, that's where, there is an international body that I mentioned, the World Organisation for Animal Health, the OIE. Australia is a member country of that, and one of the obligations of member countries is to actually encourage and assist other countries to lift their animal welfare standards. So there is an international body that we should be actively participating in anyway. There is nothing stopping us from caring about animals in other countries, and in the same way that we care about people in other countries and assisting them to raise their standards. It doesn't take us actually sending the wrong message to them in the first place, that animals should be exported and be treated in a way that is not acceptable in our country. Someone in the first place has to set an example for things to change, and currently we're not doing that. One of the many things I couldn't talk to tonight was the damage that the trade has done in the Middle East. So many places I went to, they thought that Australians approved of their treatment of animals because we've supplied them with them for decades. So it was reinforcing their current patterns of behaviour. That's only being changed now with what the government's having to do because of the work that we are doing, which is exposing and opposing. Someone at the start of it has to expose, oppose and say things need to change. There's no reason. And, we are working with international groups. This week, the OIE is meeting in Paris. We viewed a video that Compassion in World Farming, the major farm animal organisation, is presenting to all of the 167 delegates or whatever there are. And that entire video was full of evidence that was gathered by Animals Australia and a section provided by RSPCA Australia to the whole world delegates. That's what our work has been doing. and calling on the OIE to do more, to do what they're meant to do, which is raise standards. But Australia has to play their role in that, and the first part of that is to set the right example.
We've got time for one more question. Yeah, right in front of you.
Yeah, look, just thanks you've arrived in Canberra on a very sad night at the start of the kangaroo cull, so that's just a different issue I'd like to talk about. But look, you worried about the happy meat syndrome that Animals Australia might be getting themselves dragged into, like the idea that improving animal welfare makes people feel better about eating meat rather than giving the message that maybe we shouldn't be eating meat at all?
Well, I think that you have to our focus is always going to be on reducing suffering in the quickest possible way. And so the message, first and foremost, with a trade like this, if we were to come out and say, don't send them anything, or, you know, Indonesia should just stop eating cattle, we're not going to get anywhere. We have to, I think, have a message and a campaign goal that is actually going to reduce suffering first and foremost. You know, if I was to stand here and talk to broader issues, I would talk to you about the reasons why we should be reconsidering our diet, and reasons which you obviously know well. But with this particular issue, when we're talking about countries that are a long, long, long way away from rethinking their diet, the first thing we actually have to get them start to think about is animals as living beings that are deserving of humane treatment. And I think that's what this is about, and what Australia is in a position now to project to them, so that they're actually reaching that first step in their considerations. So I think everything that we work on is different, and every strategy we use is appropriate to the issue that we're working on.
Sorry, just a quick question from me, Lyn. Can you tell us what you think, why are the Jordanians different? Why is the royal family so interested, or is that a misreading of how people feel about this in the Middle East?
Look, I have good friends in Egypt that are appalled by what goes on in that country. I think you'll find good people in every country. It's a bit like here. Very few people go into abattoirs in Australia. Very few people go into abattoirs in the Middle East. I mean, the religious festival, the Festival of Sacrifice, is quite overt in its suffering, but that has been justified through religion for so long. The reason why the royal family is involved was, and you know, one particular incident can be life-changing, as it was for me, as it was for Princess Alia, and I brought that to her attention. And you know, she's talked about the fact that she could have sat there and done nothing and it would have been on her conscience for the rest of her life. I'd love to have a princess on board here, because we went to that particular facility, she made a phone call and a bulldozer came around the corner and razed it to the ground. So that's the joy of having a princess involved. So, and that's been, you know, in Jordan, where we've been working actively on the ground. Stunning has been embraced. As you heard, 80% of animals are being stunned there. Workers are recognising that it's not only better for the animals, it's better for them and their safety. So there are arguments. Our industry's just never put them out there in the way that they are going to be accepted. They've just given animals. So Jordan shows that change can be achieved. And I've got into the unusual situation of having about 5 slaughterhouse managers from Jordan that hug me whenever they see me now, which I never actually thought would be part of my
Can I grab the mic off you for a sec? Look, I just want to thank Lyn for coming along tonight and giving a fascinating presentation. I've never heard that argument for a monarchy in Australia before, but you might have got me. Look, just a quick poll. Put up your hand if you knew Australia was the largest exporter of animals in the world, live animals.
Oh, thank God, otherwise we wouldn't have been doing our job.
Yeah, no, I think that when I first learnt that, I was surprised. I think, and you know, just as Australia is the world's largest exporter of coal, we sort of convince ourselves in Australia that we can't make a difference. But if we actually understand what we do and who we are, then I think there's incredible opportunities through the kind of information that you've done such a great job of getting out, and to the RSPCA as well. It struck me, for some of our regulars, there were some parallels between your talk and a great talk we had a little while back from Ronnie Khan, who set up Zero Waste Australia. And I don't know if some people here will remember, but basically it's an organisation that recycles food. Oh, sorry, what did I say? Zero Waste Australia. Oh, God. Oz Harvest, absolutely. They collect food that would be chucked out, and they've, you know, literally handed out millions of meals now. But her story was very similar. She just never thought that her life was going to revolve around you know, rescuing food, but she's made an incredible difference, as has you, and as have you, and I think really that's something that we've all taken out of tonight, is that, yeah, you know, you can make a difference, but it takes a lot of work and probably takes a bit of anger at sometimes to keep going, but without it, then people wouldn't know what they now do, and our politicians who might not be leading yet hopefully will be led by people like you and people like everyone here tonight. So, again, if you want to know about future events, sign up at the door. But please join me in thanking Lyn for what I think was an amazing talk.